Hello, and welcome to You Don't Have to Yell, the webcast and podcast designed to transcend the two-party paradigm and promote policies and reforms that will help America adapt to a changing world. I'm your host, Dan Sally, and one of the things we talk a lot about on this show, and for those of you who've been following YDHTY for a while, you already know this, is the idea that this decade will be one of the most transformative in American history, right up there with the Great Depression, World War II era, right up there with the Civil War, and right up there with the American Revolution. And that is what made me so excited to be able to speak with the guest for this episode. Mauro Guillén is a political economist, sociologist, and professor at the Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania, where he is regarded as one of the school's most innovative thinkers. And that is a school with no shortage of innovative thinkers. Now, his new book, 2030, How Today's Biggest Trends Will Collide and Reshape the Future of Everything, describes how technological innovation, changes in the economy, and changes in demographics will make 2030 a much different world than the one we live in today. Now, during our conversation, we talk about some of those trends and the ways America will need to adapt, both as a country, but also as individuals to meet them. I hope you enjoy this episode as much as I enjoyed making it. And if you like it, give us a like by gently pressing that like button, or you can subscribe again by gently pressing that subscribe button. We don't smash any buttons here. We're going to take it easy. All right, folks? So with that out of the way, I give you Mauro Guillén. Yeah, and I have to ask before we jump into the meat of it, my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that your tenure at the University of Pennsylvania has only been rivaled by Benjamin Franklin. Is that correct?
Yes, I always joke about that. I've been at
Yeah.
Penn for 25 years now, which is a very long time.
Yeah. Well, hopefully they give you a statue too. I think
Well,
that's worthy of it.
I doubt that's going to happen.
Yeah. All right. Well, I'll start the campaign. The other thing I'd like to note is that before every episode, I always like to do as much research as I can on the guests. And in the case of Mauro, I had come across his book over the weekend and ordered it on Amazon, shot Mauro an email, and quite literally, I think before I could even check out, he had already replied and we had already booked this. So you also bear the distinction of being faster than Jeff Bezos. So you can put that on your bio if you'd like.
I love responding to email quickly. I don't write long emails, but
You
I
don't.
respond very, very quickly.
You have a knack for brevity and expedience. So I'm a big fan. Now, getting into what brought us together, originally I had found your work doing some research on immigration, and I'd like to dig into that a little bit and kind of talk about some of the demographic changes that are going to make our approach to that change or make changes necessary. But before we get into that, a lot of your book seems to be based on the concept of lateral thinking. And so before we jump into some of the specific issues, can you just explain lateral thinking to the audience?
Yeah, lateral thinking is all about connecting the dots. That is to say, instead of taking each trend in isolation of the others, what I encourage people to do in the book is to think about how those trends, economic, demographic, and technological trends come together to produce very unanticipated, very surprising outcomes in the world. So once again, it's all about taking into consideration not just one thing at a time, but rather think about how they are laterally connected. Because in so doing, I think you will discover not only major threats, I think, on the horizon, but also very big opportunities.
Yeah. And now, one of those trends that you cited in your book and that actually brought me to your book was the aging population in the United States and for that matter, the rest of the developed world and the impact that's going to have on the economies. And you prescribe immigration as a potential solution to that. Can you talk a little bit about that?
So immigration is, of course, a highly politicized issue these days.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's really important to think about what kinds of things we can accomplish if we have a rational immigration policy.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the most important benefits from immigration is the rebalancing of the age structure of the population. The American population, as well as the European one, is aging very quickly because we're not having a lot of babies. And therefore, if we bring in immigrants who are willing to work in their 20s, in their 30s, in their 40s, that will help us rebalance the age structure, which would be really, really important in terms of making sure that we have a social security system that can work.
Mm-hmm. And, kind of building on that too, you mentioned the highly politicized nature of immigration. One of the things I've noticed is that when you look at demographics globally, the parts of the world with the largest share of young people, of the type of people we're going to need, are in sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America, which are two regions that I would argue American immigration policy has been less than friendly to, let's say, over the past few years. Do you feel we may have hurt ourselves in a way with recent policies, or is this something we can correct?
So Africa and Latin America, from the point of view of the United States, are perhaps right now among the most important origins of immigrants, especially, of course, Latin America, and within Latin America, Central America. Mm-hmm. Now, in many of those countries, remember that the reason why people are migrating is because there are no jobs, or because there's a political crisis, or there's violence and drug-related crime, and so on and so forth. So I think the United States, like any other country, has the right to essentially decide who can get in. And I think that's why it makes a lot of sense to have an immigration policy that tries to essentially get all of the benefits from it, both for the immigrants and for the United States as a recipient country. And I think there's a lot to gain here if we can find a way of essentially establishing agreements with all of those countries in Latin America and in Africa that are major origins of immigrants into the United States, and come up with a system that hopefully eliminates the human drama and all of the tragic events that every now and then happen at the border. I think it's really important after so many years to engage in immigration reform and to think about immigration as something that can be beneficial to both the host country and the home country of the immigrant.
Yeah. Are there any specific reforms you'd recommend?
Well, number one at the top of everyone's list, I think, is to make sure that immigrants right now in the United States or in other parts of the world who are paperless, they don't have legal status, but they've been living in the country for many, many years. Some of them, in fact, have been, as you know, in the country since they were very, very young, even infants. So I think that should be the top priority, to essentially bring all of those people into the legal mainstream, right? By granting them the so-called path to citizenship. But I think the other really important thing is to think about where is the American economy going to be 5 years from now, 10 years from now? What type of labor are we going to need? And look, when you analyze that carefully, and there's a lot of studies on this, what is very clear is that we need both low-skilled and high-skilled immigrants. Just to give you an idea here, 30%, between 30 and 35% of the doctors and the nurses and the specialized technicians in the American healthcare system were born outside of the United States. So look, I don't know how we're going to deal with future pandemics. I don't know how we're going to deal with a rapidly aging population that is going to require healthcare without immigration. But let's not forget, at the low end in terms of skills, we also need immigration because we produce agricultural products. We have so many industries that require some measure, some quantity of unskilled labor. So we also need unskilled immigrants to come to the country. So in other words, there's so many benefits, especially from the point of view of the economy.
Now there's, obviously a lot of economic angst, I think, amongst some circles in America about immigration. Another area of economic angst as well is specifically China, and China rising as a military, but also as an economic rival. And, as I was digging into your work, one of the things you mentioned is how Asia's middle class is going to rival that of the EU or of the United States. And I think in a lot of cases, the dialogue has really been focused here in terms of a negative, in terms of us losing something. But in my mind, and I'd love your thoughts on this, it seems like there is an opportunity here for us as well. Am I right?
Well, the rise of China is just a fact of life. I mean, this is a big country that over the last 30 or 40 years has essentially grown its economy very, very quickly. So it is a fact now that China already is the second biggest economy in the world, the second biggest consumer market. And whether we like it or not, we have to accept that reality in which China is going to be a big player. We may not like some aspects of it, but what I think should be the best posture for the United States is to bring China to the table, talk about the issues. We have issues over security in Taiwan and elsewhere. We have issues over intellectual property protections, as you know, over fair trade. So what we need to do is to engage China. We cannot ignore them. And obviously, we cannot isolate China from the rest of the world. We have major economies in the area that are friends of ours, countries that are aligned with us, such as Japan or South Korea or India, Australia. So we're not alone in that region. What I think is really important for the United States when thinking about China is not to see it necessarily as a threat, but rather as something that a country that we need to monitor, that we need to be careful about. But by all means, let's engage with them and let's try to come to a solution to the problems, bilateral problems that we have.
Yeah, and again, I'm going to engage in a little lateral thinking here, and I'll take your course on a pass fail. But it seems to me that the current American model is really based on, I think, and is based in large part on maybe exporting our values as well. And in the case of China, we may have to accept the fact that they're going to be a very large, powerful country that's going to do some things we don't like, and figure out where we can agree. Because to your point,
absolutely. Yeah. But look, there's a fundamental difference between the United States and China, which is that we have a lifestyle, we have a culture that we can export, and the entire world loves our culture. China doesn't have that. China doesn't have anything, I think, ideological that they can export. And so I think here we have the upper hand. We have the high moral ground. And I think what we need to do is just to, in addition to seizing the high moral ground, we also need to protect our economic interests. It's as simple as that.
That's interesting. That's really interesting. I've often thought about even Hollywood as a tool of American soft power in a way, and it seems that's kind of what you're saying. Am I right there?
Absolutely correct. You're right on target there.
Yeah. So jumping to another subject that often provokes angst, and just for the folks listening so far, I'm going to tell you, it's not going to be all doom and gloom. We're going to have a nice happy ending, but I want to ask this question, which is, one of the areas that I think causes a lot of stress in our economy, or a lot of worry, is the role of automation and the role of AI, and the fact that a lot of jobs that exist today are most likely going to be done by robots not too far into the future, or by machines. Do you see an equal opportunity there as well?
Well, not really, because automation, like all of these major, technological breakthroughs and processes of adoption that we've seen over the last few decades, essentially benefits certain people, but then hurts other people. And that this is just the way things are whenever, you have a major transformation. And of course, when you have automation in manufacturing, or now also in the service sector, you will inevitably have workers who lose their jobs. And it's not easy for them to find another job, maybe because they're already in their 50s. And so it's a little bit too late for them, they think, to find another occupation or another profession. So technological change, automation in particular, can make a lot of people unhappy and angry. And that's why I think, both in Europe and the United States, we've seen over the last few years this phenomenon of some of those people who feel forgotten, essentially voting for politically extreme options in elections. So I think we need to be more proactive about this. You can anticipate how many companies are going to be investing in new robotics or in new artificial intelligence-based systems, and therefore how many jobs are going to be lost and exactly where. I think we need to be much better at planning, and we need to anticipate the social dislocation that automation can bring about.
Yeah. And so what's the solution there? Is it education? Is it, continued upskilling of workers? Like what are some things we can do to help address that?
Yeah, so the most targeted intervention is, as you're saying, education, retraining, providing those workers with other opportunities,
Mhm.
perhaps even asking companies that automate to pay a tax so that we can fund those programs. You see, you and I pay taxes in the United States, correct?
Mhm. Mhm.
But the robots don't pay taxes. I think that's very unfair. I think the
Mhm.
robots should also be paying taxes, taxes that then we could use not to build roads like we do with the gasoline tax, but rather to help those workers who are displaced by technological change. And then more broadly, Dan, I think perhaps the moment has come, both in Europe and the United States, for us to have a national debate about a guaranteed minimum income.
Mhm.
Because we are in a consumer-oriented economy. But if people lose their jobs, if wages stagnate, if there's not enough purchasing power, then eventually that's going to hurt the economy and that's going to hurt everybody. So I think I'm not necessarily arguing in favor of a universal, not a universal, but rather a guaranteed minimum income. But I think we should at least have the debate about the advantages and the disadvantages of that.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that your book got me thinking about, which is it seems to me and there's another topic I want to get to that touches on this in a second, but it does seem to me as like if we have to revisit capitalism in this country in a way, and I'm a capitalist, so but it does feel as if we really need to revisit this model um, where survival is linked to time and income or time and labor, and that there has to be some way to provide a floor for those folks who are going to be left out if we're going to continue to progress, if we're going to continue to have a dynamic economy that unfortunately includes people being put out of work. Um, the one subject you talk about that I think touches on that as well is the sharing economy and these apps that almost change the nature of ownership in a way. And could you talk a little bit about that? Because I found that part really fascinating.
Yeah, so the sharing economy comes in many, shapes and forms. We have, for example, ride hailing, right? I mean, you can go out and get an Uber or a Lyft,
Yeah.
or you can find a place to stay that is not a hotel, and so on and so forth. So this type of sharing economy has essentially made ownership not a requirement for gaining access to certain assets, such as a car
Hmm.
or a home. And so, especially among young people, the idea of ownership these days, I think, has lost in terms of its appeal. Remember,
Hmm.
the American dream was to own a home, to own a car, to start a family.
Hmm.
But now it seems that some of those values are not widely shared by the younger generations. But the sharing economy is much more than that. It's also, for example, the gig economy. That is to say that companies share workers. So you're a worker, you have certain skills, but instead of having a full-time job at a company, what you do is you go to one of these platforms, digital platforms, and then you look for things to do, and they pay you, right? And in other words, you're going to be employed, so to speak, by several companies, not just by one. And the gig economy, I think, is something that has been vilified because obviously it can also mean that some people don't have healthcare, they don't have good benefits, and so on and so forth.
Hmm.
But for people who want flexibility, for people who don't want to work full time, it's actually a godsend, right? I mean, the gig economy, which is again one part of the sharing economy, I think it's a great innovation. Once again, assuming that only people who want to work part time on a flexible schedule and all of that are the ones who go there, and then the others just get a full time job with all of the benefits.
Yeah, and kind of building on something you said earlier too, I think in a way, if the government views its role as providing a floor for people to support them in the areas that the economy doesn't, in a lot of ways, that gig economy no longer becomes a four-letter word. You know, if you're working without health benefits or retirement benefits, but or for that matter, education benefits, but the government's providing those, I think that takes a little of that stress away. And you know, one other thing I'll throw out there is, you know, my son can't drive due to a physical disability, and you know, it's been something my wife and I have talked about. And you know, the thing I've always thought is, you know, in another 10 years, I'd imagine the nature of car ownership is going to change because
Mhm.
as you know, as autonomous vehicles hit the road, you
Absolutely.
already right. Like it seems to me like I would rather subscribe to a car service than I would own a car and have to deal with the headache of
Correct.
maintenance and everything else.
Because you see, on average, Americans who own a car only use the car about 5 or 6% of the time.
Hmm.
So it's not a very reasonable thing to do, to own your own car. And you're right. I mean, once we get to autonomous vehicles, I think that's going to be really the moment at which car ownership may decline big time here in the United States.
I'm laughing because I think I've probably filled my tank up. You know, I could probably count on my fingers how many times I filled my tank up since the pandemic started. So, yeah, so interesting, interesting. I have two more questions for you here. One is on just our level of preparedness, which we talked a little bit about before. You know, out of all the trends you look at, which ones do you feel we're the least prepared for?
Well, right now, I think the biggest challenge that we're facing is with cities. And
Hmm.
it's true that the pandemic has reduced the attractiveness of living downtown. As you know, many families are moving further out in the age of remote work.
Yeah.
But you see, we have a big problem with cities. Cities occupy only 1% of the land in the world, but they're home right now to about 60% of the population, and that's
Hmm.
growing. And cities account for 80% of the carbon emissions, 80%.
Hmm.
So in other words, I think we need to make cities more efficient, more energy efficient,
Hmm.
less polluting. We need to make them more livable. We need to make them less wasteful. And in so doing, I think we're going to be able to address the problem of climate change. Because the problem of climate change essentially originates from the cities,
Hmm.
right? I mean, that's where most of the problem lies. So I think that is perhaps the most urgent thing that we need to do, is the most important trend that I think we need to pay attention to. Because once again, in spite of the pandemic, cities are growing because people in Sub-Saharan Africa, people in South Asia, they want to move from the small village to the city because they feel that that's where the opportunities are. And it's
Hmm.
probably true.
Yeah.
So we cannot continue down this path to a point where we have 70, 80, 90% of the population in the world living in cities. In other words, occupying just 1 or 2% of the land. Um, we need to plan. We need to make cities better places from the point of view of climate change. Because otherwise, I think this is an issue that is going to make our lives really, really hard. It's going to be really difficult to address this issue if we don't tackle it now, let's say 10 or 20 years down the road.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting you talk about the inefficiency of cities because I think in a lot of cases, you know, conventional wisdom would say, and it would say that, you know, urban living in some ways is more efficient. So, an example here in Boston, where I live, you know, we have a great public transportation system. You're generally, if you're living in the city, you're generally not driving because driving in the city is terrible. In addition to having a great public transportation system, you know, you're living in a smaller space, so you're not consuming as much resources in terms of maybe heat or electricity. But what are some of the more wasteful aspects of cities maybe that I'm missing?
Yeah, well, let me tell you a few pieces of information here. But first of all, Boston is a wonderful city. I've lived there for 4 years.
Oh, great.
But, city is a very small city. I mean, Boston
Yeah.
is a very small city.
Yeah.
A little bit more than 1 million people. And that's if you count everybody in the metropolitan area, right?
Yeah.
So, right now in the world, we have 10 mega cities with more than 20 million people. Right?
Hmm.
And by the year 2030, we're likely going to have 15 or 20 of those.
Hmm.
Altogether, there are probably about 200 cities in the world that are bigger than Boston. And that's where the problem is. I'm not too concerned about Boston itself, because as you said, it's a city that has public transportation. It's a city where people tend to be, or behave in ways that are environmentally conscious and so on and so
Hmm.
forth. But let me just give you another statistic here. On average, here in the United States, when people are driving their cars downtown, 30% of the time, they're looking for a parking space. Now, that
Mm.
doesn't make any sense to me,
Mhm.
right? I mean, we should be able to come up with smart parking systems with sensors. Maybe we can use an app on our phone telling us that's your closest parking spot, right? Or parking garage for that matter. And here's the cost, and so on and so forth. But we haven't done it yet. And it really bothers me because not only we're wasting time, but more importantly, we're polluting and we're emitting carbon right into the atmosphere. I mean, this is crazy. 30% of the time, that's a lot, right?
Yeah.
And so I think this is just one example among many. Let me give you another one. 30% of the food that reaches cities gets wasted here in the United States, according to the
Yeah.
US Department of Agriculture. If I remember correctly, it's 31%. Okay, it's around 30%. Well, as you know, to produce food, to transport it, you need to use energy. And therefore, you're also polluting and you're emitting carbon. So in other words, I think also as consumers, we should be less wasteful. This whole thing, when you and I were growing up, that our parents would tell us, you have to finish what's on your plate. I think we have forgotten about that. And now we no longer finish what's on our plate. We
Yeah.
actually cook too much food and then we just throw it into the trash can. And that is one of the most environmentally unfriendly things that we can do.
I am going to save this clip and play it for my kids because I am an absolute stickler for not ordering or buying anything else until we finish what's in the fridge.
Exactly
And
right.
they hate it and they hate the leftovers, but kids, I've got a professor on my side now, so it's your move. Final question for you, and thank you for giving me that notch in my belt. I was not looking for you to resolve any family arguments, but since you're here,
I'm happy to help with your domestic troubles.
Thank you. So, last question for you. You know, a lot of these discussions and a lot of the questions I've asked you have really been framed in the negative. They've been framed in the ways that might harm or change our way of life negatively. But in your work, I see a lot of reason for hope too. And I guess when you look at the future, do you share my optimism? Do you see a bright future? Do you see maybe a negative future, or is it just too early to tell?
Oh no, I'm a realistic optimist.
Okay.
So look, there's no shortage of problems here in the United States and around the world. And I think this past year has been a stark reminder of how many issues, open issues we have, and how important it would be to start addressing them. But look, in any kind of major transformation, such as the one that we're going through right now, as you said at the beginning, for the longest time, we haven't been in this situation with so many things essentially shifting. I think there's also lots of opportunities that emerge, lots of opportunities for entrepreneurs, for investors, for sure, for companies, but also for each of us to essentially think again about how we're getting things done, how we are approaching life. You see, I view this transformation and the pandemic as well as a big reset button. So we are in a position in which we can push the reset button and think about how can we do things differently? How can we do things in a way that are better for everyone? How can we reduce inequality in access to education and so many other things? So I'm really hopeful that we can use this crisis as a way to come up with a society that is better and more, fairer to everyone. I think that would be really a very good outcome out of this tragedy, that of course has claimed more than 500,000 American lives, but maybe we can make the most out of it in terms of, rethinking our future.
Yeah, and to wax poetically at the end of this conversation, one of the statues, at least one of the statues I know of Ben Franklin on the University of Pennsylvania, is a young Ben Franklin as he was walking into Philadelphia for the first time. And I think if you look at the time where Benjamin Franklin lived, you could very well have viewed it as the end of the world. But thankfully, due to the actions of certain people and due to the thinking of certain people, we laid the groundwork for this conversation right here. So I'd agree with you. I think we can definitely look at this as the opportunity to really adapt to change and really build something better on top of it. I really thank you for your time here, And I'm sorry I didn't book you for the whole day, but at the very least, I might have you have to have you over for dinner to correct my kids and a few other things. So I'll
Well,
and
absolutely, Dan. It's been a pleasure to be on your podcast, and I wish you and your family and the entire audience here all the best for the future, and please stay healthy.
thank you so much. Thank you so much, and congrats on the appointment to Cambridge as well.
Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed that episode, and if you did, you can learn more by visiting YDHTY and clicking the link that says episodes in the upper right hand corner. You'll see a synopsis of this episode with additional resources, along with a list of a bunch of prior episodes I'm sure you're going to love. You can also follow YDHTY on iTunes or Spotify. And of course, you can follow us here on YouTube. Just go ahead and gently press that subscribe button. Again, gentle, gentle. We're going to take it easy. Until the next, this is Dan Sally. Bye-bye.